Welcome back to The Daily Poem here on the Close Reads Podcast Network. I'm David Kern. Today's poem is by Mary Oliver, who, as you know, died earlier this year, back in January. She died at the age of 83. She lived from 1935 to 2019. She won the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize, and is known as the best-selling American poet, at least in recent decades. Today's poem is called, quite simply and appropriately, Spring. It goes like this. Somewhere, a black bear has just risen from sleep and is staring down the mountain. All night, in the brisk and shallow restlessness of early spring, I think of her. Her 4 black fists flicking the gravel, her tongue like a red fire touching the grass, the cold water. There is only one question: how to love this world. I think of her rising like a black and leafy ledge to sharpen her claws against the silence of the trees. Whatever else my life is, with its poems and its music and its glass cities, it is also this dazzling darkness coming down the mountain, breathing and tasting. All day I think of her, her white teeth, her wordlessness, her perfect love. I have this poem from an anthology, and I was searching to see if she had other poems that were related to this one. And I actually noticed that she has several poems just with the title Spring. So I will post an image of this poem on the Close Reads Podcast Instagram page, at Close Reads Pods on Instagram, if you want to see a picture of it, if you want to see what it looks like. But that got me thinking, it's not surprising that a poet like Mary Oliver would spend a lot of time thinking about the poetry of spring. Nor is it surprising that she spent a lot of time talking about wild animals. I mean, basically all her poems do that to some degree or another. She talks about foxes, and she talks about geese, and, all kinds of animals, horses, dogs. But here she turns to a bear, and she offers all these images that lead to these conclusions that I have questions about. Not because I think that they're wrong, that her conclusions are wrong, but because I don't always know how to interpret them. And I've talked about this before. It's not that I think that she is trying to be particularly mysterious or confusing or confounding or whatever words you want to use. I think she is just taking the images one from the other, and it's leading her to conclusions that are very intimate and personal to her. And sometimes one of the hardest things to do when reading poetry is to identify and figure out exactly how to interpret or take in what is clearly someone else's very particular experience. I mean, there's a universality to it, but identifying that difference between the universal and the particular can sometimes be the challenging part for, I think, many people when they're reading poetry. So, for example, I always wonder here, why does she say that the bear has perfect love at the end? Why does she say she thinks of her perfect love? I wonder why her tongue is like a red fire. I wonder what it means to sharpen her claws against the silence of the trees. And that's one of those great Mary Oliver images where you have this very specific thing that is very real. Bears sharpening their claws against trees. But she can drop that little word in there to deepen the image, to make it more universal, to make the particular universal. There's something in the silence of the trees that enhances the whole system of metaphors that she's offering here. And I wonder how her life is this dazzling darkness that's coming down the mountain. In what ways is she sharpening her claws against the silence of the trees? In what ways is her tongue like a red fire touching the grass? In what ways is she standing at the top of the mountain, looking down? Certainly, I imagine it has something to do with coming out of a long sleep, coming out of hibernation, of taking in the beauty of the world and being reminded of the necessity of it. Taking in both the pleasure and the necessity of it. The bear can take pleasure in things of the world. It sort of is able to experience the poetry of the world without being self-aware that it's doing so, while also being utilitarian. I don't know that I've ever read this anywhere, but I've always thought that that's one of the things about Mary Oliver, that she sees creatures being able to, without having to be self-aware, experiencing the poetry of the world and also allowing it to be the utility that it must be for them. It seems like we as people are unable to distance ourselves from those two concepts. I feel like both those things are at play in much of her work, and that's one of the things that she seems to be getting at here. So I always wondered how that concept is meant to be applied to one's individual life. And I don't have a lot of answers for that, but those are the kind of questions that this poem and poems like it by Mary Oliver bring to mind. So I'll read it one more time for you. Hopefully you don't mind some open-ended question asking in this episode. Spring by Mary Oliver. Somewhere, a black bear has just risen from sleep and is staring down the mountain. All night, in the brisk and shallow restlessness of early spring, I think of her 4 black fists flicking in the gravel, her tongue like a red fire touching the grass, the cold water. There is only one question: how to love this world. I think of her rising like a black and leafy ledge to sharpen her claws against the silence of the trees. Whatever else my life is, with its poems and its music and its glass cities, it is also this dazzling darkness coming down the mountain, breathing and tasting. All day I think of her white teeth, her wordlessness, her perfect love. This has been the Daily Poem. Thanks so much for listening. I'll be back on Monday with another poem for you.